All right, guys, on today's episode, I talked with Professor Nathan Jenkins. He works in the exercise phys department at UGA at the University of Georgia. He's also been a contributor to the CrossFit Journal and is working on some stuff for specific exercise phys courses for CrossFit. So we had a really fun conversation. It was a little bit nerdy. So for those of you that like to talk about metabolic pathways and things like that, tune in, take some notes in there. But largely what we talked about is trying to figure out better ways to bridge the gap between academia and practitioners. And Nate is no better person to do that because he teaches CrossFit in his college level courses with regard to strength and conditioning and exercise phys. So it was a really fun conversation. He's an incredibly smart guy and doing some really cool stuff. So here's my interview with Professor Nathan Jenkins. All right, everybody, welcome back to the best hour of their day. Fern here. I am here with Professor Nathan Jenkins. He's been a contributor to the journal. He's doing some stuff for some of the course curriculum for the level 1, level 2, level 3 kind of pipeline that we have. And I think he's just a really interesting guy with regard. Mike G turned me on to him. He's lives in Athens, Georgia, where he's a professor there in the exercise phys department. He's a Great Dane owner, which I was for a long time. I lived in Athens, so lots in common here. So thanks for your time, brother.
Hey, man, thanks for having me on.
So real quick, you're probably very much an outsider when it comes to. You're a professional in the exercise phys world. You teach exercise phys at the university level, but are obviously an avid lover of CrossFit. You've got to be like the black sheep.
Yes. I have some things in common with my colleagues in terms of, how we teach our classes and actually a lot of our fundamental approaches to physiology and how we do our research. But I am definitely not part of the mainstream when it comes to how I think about exercise and how I think exercise ought to be prescribed and versus how it is currently prescribed, and how, like, a lot of our messaging about like exercise recommendations and guidelines and so forth for the last 20 years, I've come to a very different place than, again, like the mainstream ideology in our field. And that is largely through CrossFit and how that evolution has happened. And I think that's a real kind of long but short way of saying it. That's how I ended up here, I guess. How I've gotten to know a lot of people in the CrossFit space is through some of the ideas that I have about it and some of the stuff I put out there on social media and so forth, and just some people I've gotten to meet and interact with. So yeah, I'm very different from your average exercise physiology professor.
Is that a pretty contentious place to be? Like what is that like in the halls of university? Do people just kind of give you the stink eye and they're just like, oh, it's the CrossFit guy? Yeah.
If I get the stink eye, it's like, oh crap, that's the guy that will not shut the fuck up about CrossFit. I've heard enough of your episodes to know I can say that on here.
Yeah, that's fine.
No, you know what? I think there is not quite sufficient awareness yet of the things that I'm doing, at least in the like amongst like my colleagues, for example. Mm-hmm. They know that I do CrossFit. They now know in 2019 what CrossFit is and can have a conversation about it with me, and like probably just in general, because that's a lot to do to the growth of CrossFit as well. I think the evolution and expansion of understanding of what CrossFit is, I've seen it change a lot, and I haven't been doing CrossFit all that long. I just started in 2015.
Okay.
So pretty new CrossFitter in the grand scheme of things. So
were you teaching well, let me ask the first question. Have you taken the level 1 course?
I have. Yep.
So you definitely strike me as a person who sits in there and is listening to the What is Fitness lecture and is just like, this is it. This is what I've been looking for.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, well, definitely in the lecture, I'll never forget it. Like especially like the part where you guys talk about like intensity is exactly equal to power, right? That's a concept that resonates very deeply with me on multiple levels, and is like the heart of actually the research that we're doing in my lab right now. It's yeah, absolutely, for sure. The But the moment you're talking about, like that, this is it, actually was before that, when like in the first year or two I was doing CrossFit, and I just like immersed myself in all the stuff that Greg and others, but mainly Greg, has written in the CrossFit Journal about basically what I think of as CrossFit science,
Mm-hmm.
and applying concepts of physics and like kinematics to human movement, and presenting, for example, a scientifically useful definition of fitness. That was the time, and you guys can hear my dogs crashing around in the background, I'm sorry. That was the time that I had that, like, holy crap, this is actually what I've been looking for, and been thinking, things I've been thinking about, but haven't quite been able to crystallize conceptually until then. And so, yes, that moment has happened for me, and it continues to actually happen.
So here's what I don't particularly understand, and you might be able to help me just because you're in that world. You know, I'm fortunate enough to be obviously heavily immersed in the course curriculum. So I teach the level 1 and the level 2 course. And I struggle to understand why people are so adverse to CrossFit when the literature, at least in my mind, is so profound and largely objective, right? So it is, yeah, and everybody who's ever heard Coach Glassman speak knows how he feels about science and data and objective measurable, observable, repeatable data.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, from your experience, what is the sticking point for people kind of buying in on it?
I guess we have to qualify that like right now in 2019 or historically, because I think the answer to that has evolved and is changing. I think.
Well, feel free to talk about both. Yeah, I mean,
I'll start with what I understand. Like, I'll start with, so when I started CrossFit in 2015, it was after a year of, or maybe 6 months or so of contemplating before I even decided I was going to do it. The stimulus from that contemplation was I had students in the exercise physiology class I was teaching at the university come up to me after class one day. It's like, hey, what do you think about CrossFit? And I was like, what? I had heard the term and was generally familiar with people like flipping tires and climbing ropes and stuff, but didn't really know enough about it to give an intelligent answer. So I went back to my office or back home or whatever and looked it up and just like read. I went to CrossFit.com. I'm sure, I don't remember exactly what I saw, but just tried to learn a little bit more about it. And I'll tell you, my initial gut reaction to what I was understanding about CrossFit at that time was an adverse response, like you're describing, like skepticism, doubt, concern. So the concern was, okay, that's a good way to get injured really fast.
mm-hmm.
And this is not for the average person. This is not something that anyone that's just like off the street, that we need to get more physically active to get healthier, to prevent chronic disease, which, by the way, that is historically for the last 10 plus years, my main research interest is exercise for the prevention and treatment of chronic disease. So at that time, it was like, no way, this would never work. However, for me too, I'm a trained scientist, right? And part of like a learned reflex, it was not a natural reflex, but a learned reflex for me professionally is anytime that I'm presented with something that runs counter to my my preconceived notions, that runs different from like the hypothesis that I would naturally have, I need to like look into that a little bit more, right? I need that is actually, it's my scientific duty to examine it because my natural inclination is to just dismiss it right away, like knee-jerk reaction, dismiss. So that was what I was doing with CrossFit. And I was like, wait a minute, but there's maybe something to it then. And then after thinking about it a little bit more, there was also a lot to like about it from a science, like you said, objective scientific perspective, which is it goes back 40, 50 years in the research literature, the concept that intensity is the most important element of the training stimulus. Like if you got intensity, frequency, duration, overall volume, and the intensity is more important than all the other ones. You can train 2 days a week and get the same adaptation as if you train 5 days a week, as long as those 2 days a week are going really, really hard. Like that's something that concept goes back to, there's great classic studies of this from the 1960s that support that idea. And so it's like, okay, well, this is really cool. There's intensity there. And then the other part that was unique to me, a unique observation, was like, wow, those movements they describe them as functional movements, and I can actually see that. I mean, you don't have to be trained as, you have to have a PhD to appreciate the transfer of skill. That I wouldn't use this term at the time, but the transfer of skill from a deadlift to carrying groceries, right? Like that's obvious. And it's like, wow, okay, so that's getting more and more people to kind of do that stuff. So let me think about this. So anyway, long story short is after contemplating it, again, the initial thing was from a couple students who were in my class came up to me after class asking me these questions. I wanted to give them an answer. Looked into it for myself. I was like, damn, this is really cool. I want to think about this. So then I committed to the year 2015 was my year of CrossFit. I was going to try it, but not just try it for a week, because if you can't just try something as complex as this methodology and sit for like 2 days and say, oh, I like it or I don't. My minimum was going to be 3 months. And I was like, you know what, if I'm really going to do this, I need to try it for a year. So that's what I set out to do. And it took, here we are 5 years. Coming up, it'll be 5 years in January 2020.
So you brought up a very, very good point, which is and we talk about this at the seminars, is the vast majority of these things are not new concepts, right? Intensity is not a new concept. Functional movements are not a new concept. Compound yet irreducible. All the things that we talk about at the level 1 and the level 2 are not new concepts. At least in my experience, and I think I'm going on 12 years, is there's the massive misunderstanding and disconnect is around the intensity portion. Like everybody's on board with, hey, functional movements are good. You know, we need variance in order to be well-rounded. But again, going back to nobody really defined things like, at least in my opinion, as well as Coach Glassman did. And it's like they just heard it and then just skipped all of the important parts. Like intensity is the independent variable most commonly associated with maximizing the rate of return on favorable adaptation. It's like nobody knows that he wrote that, or that he wrote the What is Fitness article. And that to me is like the real challenging part, is like, you're not doing your due diligence. You just crafted opinion based on nothing. You know?
Yes. So the huge problem in our field is lack of definition of terms that we just throw around and use all the time. And that's led to a lot of perpetuation of ideas that are better described as like confusion than actual ideas. So like confusion that compounds on itself.
So like what? Like, is there something specific? So like the title of your article that you wrote in the journal is What Exercise Phys Could Learn from CrossFit. So like you talk about a little bit in there, but I don't know if you were going to talk about something more specific.
Well, like to your point a minute ago about intensity, for example, like what is intensity? And our field has really, when I say our field, like the academic exercise science has really doubled down on the VO2 max and everything if we're going to quantify relative intensity, everything is expressed as a percentage of VO2 max. And from that concept, then so it turns out if you tell somebody go exercise at 55% of their VO2 max of moderate intensity for 20 minutes, they don't know what that means. So that's right. So that was how the ACSM's guidelines were written in the 90s. It was like, you know, this is what people need to do. And then they realized nobody understood that. So they modified those guidelines. Sorry, man, 1 second, I gotta yell at these dogs.
No, you're good.
Hey, Brutus, chill out. Come up here, buddy. Hey.
Our listeners are dog lovers. It's fine.
If you don't like dogs, when I was on John Woolley's podcast, the same thing was going on. I need to find a better podcast spot, I guess. But,
well, listen, yours is better than Ackerman's. He does his in his closet, so at least we have entertainment in the background.
But I said to that audience, same thing I'll say to yours is, if you don't like dog lovers, then stop listening to this. You know, if you don't like dogs, you're not welcome here.
Exactly.
Gosh, so confusion about we go switch gears from like super cerebral stuff to nonsense. And confusion over intensity and VO2 max. So basically the field has this concept of everything is related to the VO2 max, and that is if you ask any person with a student that's majoring in exercise science that has an exercise science degree, you ask them what fitness is, and their first thing is probably going to be something along the lines of the VO2 max, which is potentially a component of fitness. The aerobic capacity, cardiovascular endurance is one of the components of fitness as I currently understand it. But that's a incomplete definition, first of all. So what we then have is a whole system of guidelines and just general guideline for exercise prescription that's based upon this idea of what is that exercise stimulus in relation to the VO2 max. Mm-hmm. So coming back to the original versions of the guidelines, actually said do 55 to 65% of VO2 max, whatever it is. We don't know what that means. So let's dumb it down a little bit, or make it a little bit more accessible to physicians and actual just people who might be prescribing these things or trying to follow them, and say, okay, that's where you get the 30 minutes a day of moderate to vigorous intensity. So those terms, moderate and vigorous, that you see written in mainstream guidelines, they are anchored to ranges of percentages of someone's VO2 max. So that whole system is predicated on VO2 max being the be all and end all measurement of someone's fitness and therefore health. And my opinion is that the whole that makes the whole system messed up, because the VO2 max is not actually, it's first of all a terrible predictor of performance. If we're going to talk about like overall work capacity, not necessarily sport performance, but an individual's work capacity, like how much weight can you move over what distance and over what time, that to me is a better measure of someone's ability and fitness, right? So that's one problem. And then two, like you're basing all your recommendations on a percentage of something that's wrong in the first place. So it's a mess. It's a total mess.
The other thing that I find problematic about it from a training standpoint. So let's say I do agree with this idea that is the guiding tenet for how I prescribe fitness and exercise to people. Mm-hmm. How do I as a trainer go about doing that with somebody? Hey, I want you to do 55%. I mean, owning an affiliate for 10 years, I can't even get people to track their 1RMs of weights.
Right.
It's just such a, it's so problematic, you know?
Yeah. There's some tools that people have come up with for like guidance, and this like heart rate, for example, it seems like, I mean, heart rate has a place. I've heard you talk about it before, and I think you and I use it probably similarly in the CrossFit setting. But heart rate to guide percent of this VO2 max, percent effort, is problematic on many levels. Most of the people that we're targeting with these messages are not going to go out and buy a freaking heart rate monitor or a Garmin that can measure, your heart rate on your wrist. So it's just, and then the other piece too that drives me a little bit crazy is the whole thing about pedometers and steps per day. And the steps per day, I've been corrected many times on this. Steps per day are not officially part of any of the physical activity guidelines, but there's still this whole notion out there that 10,000 steps per day is all you need. And so it becomes a box that you check. And it turns out that I'm not arguing with the data that says that that's beneficial for mortality. And that's the other layer to this, is like, what's our outcome? Well, if you're trying to add number of years you're going to spend on Earth, then the guidelines as we have them, they're fine. They're good. But like, what about quality of life and just like real life function and and basically quality of life and ability to enjoy your life and do normal activities and maybe sometimes abnormal activities without it just making you feel crushed or debilitated or whatever have you. Like, yes, we need to be able to put the suitcase in the overhead bin, but I don't want that to be a maximum effort lift. Right. So, those are the kind of, so yes, I am as you can tell, I am definitely in a different wavelength, in a different place in the academic space than most people, but I'm also optimistic that we're slowly starting to see that, the things change a little bit on this stuff too.
Well, I can tell that you don't fall in the typical camp, because you gave a very, very brief version of the What is CrossFit lecture just now. Like, you covered most of the things that we gave in the What is, because I just gave it 2 days ago, but and I love that lecture. But so on that note, what do you, because some of it, we were kind of going back and forth on email, and you had mentioned you had asked me some questions. But
I've got a question for you.
Yeah. So what do you think? But I guess because you kind of live in both camps.
I do.
Right. So what do you think both sides could do better to get to that point? Because, so I'm largely in the camp of it's not either or, it's largely and, right? So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that if you are ignoring everything in the exercise phys world, like that's just stupid. But if
Mm-hmm.
you are in that textbook and you're not paying attention to CrossFit is breaking down a lot of previous ideals
Mm-hmm.
based on the training methodology, that you can't just put your head in the sand on that either, which is everybody's just like, hey, high rep Olympic weightlifting is just terrible. To which
Yeah.
point, the argument is like, well, if done horribly, yes, but
Yeah.
it's been proven that it can be wildly beneficial as well.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Um, I spend most of my time thinking about what the academy, what we could do in the academy better, because of a lot of the stuff that I've learned from the CrossFit methodology. But I think it can go both ways. Um, I'll start with something specific that we're currently pursuing with my research team. So I have a team of 4 doctoral students, and they each have an army of 3 to 5 undergraduate students who help them out with their research projects. And most of these projects are centered around the idea of quantification of the exercise stimulus in terms of work and power, in terms of kinematics. Okay. So, so if we can quantify the exercise stimulus in those terms, what's the metabolic response? So like, just to give you a really practical example of something that we're testing, is like, what's the VO2 response to kettlebell swings, right? And we have a specified protocol, like, and it's different across different projects, but so the VO2 response to kettlebell swings, the VO2 response to burpees, to a Tabata style interval workout that includes burpees and kettlebell swings and rowing and dumbbell thrusters. It's really, really brutal workout, actually. Mm-hmm. And so we have a system that we can measure, like oxygen, the indirect calorimetry that you put on somebody. It's like a backpack version of the VO2, the kind of Bain style mask. For your listeners or viewers, if you haven't seen this kind of equipment, it's basically to measure the oxygen uptake response to exercise. And so what we're doing is using that to look at the metabolic response to exercise. But the other thing that we're going to try to do is get not only the oxidative response, the VO2 response, but using these tools, you can actually get an estimate of the non-oxidative response, which would be the anaerobic component. So I'm really interested in moving away from the field's obsession on all things VO2 max, et cetera, and testing this broad idea that I have, which is the anaerobic component of the exercise stimulus is directly proportional to its benefit, which is another way of saying intensity drives adaptation.
Got it. Okay. So that was what I was going to ask you, is like, what's the overall hypothesis there?
Yeah, that's the big idea. So I'm really excited about this work because, for a couple of reasons. One is I already know what's going to happen, which is a really good place to be when you're doing a research project. You know that you already know what's going to happen. 2, it will be, at the same time, it's going to be, I think, I always make this joke to my students, the 10 people who actually read the paper, it's going to be absolutely mind blowing for them. It's just something I'm really excited to put out there in the literature once we finally get to that point. And I mean, I see this as an opportunity to just shift the field's fundamental framework. Again, everything is all about the VO2 max. Well, what we're going to establish is like, what's a VO2 max for something like kettlebell swings? What's a VO2 max for burpees? As opposed to always the VO2 max is like the response to maximal effort treadmill running or cycling, stationary cycling. That's like how it's always done in the laboratory. The concept that I have, based on, again, exposure to all these different modalities through CrossFit, is that there's actually probably a maximum work capacity for each individual modality. And of course, through industry, to just trying different things in the gym setting. Coach Glassman was the first to do this, and now all of you guys, ladies who are doing CrossFit programming and coaching and so forth, are seeing this every day in your business. The magic comes when you combine these different elements in as many ways as whatever it is, as creativity will allow, as I think the quote says. So what we can do is, taking a step back from all that, is in the lab, we can start kind of taking a systematic approach, breaking things down sort of piece by piece, characterizing the response, documenting it, writing it up and putting it out there in the scientific literature, And then just, that's where I'm at right now. That's kind of like what I just said in a few minutes. It's like a 5-year kind of process. And I'm just excited.
Is that your timeline? Is 5 years?
Well, my timeline, I'm 36 and I'll retire I'm eligible for retirement at 60.
Okay.
My timeline is, and I just got, if you're familiar with, you're in the university setting, so you're probably familiar with this. I just got tenure about a year ago.
Oh, congrats.
So thank you, man. And so it's actually a really cool career kind of phase for me, is that I can kind of think really, really long range about our research direction. And the conversation about tenure and what's all involved with preparing for that is too out of the scope of this conversation, I think. But just briefly, for the first 5-6 years of my academic career, there's just a lot of pressure to publish really, really quickly and get some research funding and show that, basically prove your worth to the university. And that promotes a lot of kind of short-term thinking, like 1 to 2 year, 3-year max timeline. And I'm just really enjoying the opportunity to think really long range and like have a kind of a big vision. And what I'm describing right now for you is a lot of that vision.
That's really cool. And you've done some other stuff with regard to type 2 diabetes research as well, haven't you?
Yeah, that's been, as I mentioned a while ago, my main interest is in exercise and more also nutrition, but I'm trained as an exercise physiologist, interested in the role of exercise in the prevention and treatment of chronic disease, particularly cardiometabolic disease. So type 2 diabetes falls under that, and the vascular complications of chronic disease. So my training, this probably has been some stuff I should have talked about at the very beginning, background stuff, but my training is in exercise physiology and vascular biology. So I did my postdoc work in vascular cell biology. So,
okay.
Anyway.
And then, so when you were doing some of that stuff, how were, as far as like, when you're looking at type 2 diabetes and the effect, are you looking at the effect of exercise on type 2 diabetics? Is that just exercise related? Is it exercise and nutrition related, or what specifically was your research focused on?
My work, I have not done the nutrition piece in the setting of type 2 diabetes. What we were doing we had some funding for kind of a series of projects looking at actually the combination of exercise and metformin, first line pharmacologic therapy for type 2 diabetes, on postprandial glucose regulation. So the regulation of the blood glucose response to a high carbohydrate meal. So that was some experiments that we did in the lab. Doctoral student named Melissa Erickson did that work for her dissertation. And yeah, so that was a really cool. She did 2 studies. One was with metformin, and the other was with the second tier diabetes drugs, things that, like, when metformin is no longer effective, the physician will prescribe on top of metformin. So we call it metformin plus. So like, there's like this whole list of drugs that physicians will kind of pull out of the pharmacologic hopper when that doesn't work.
Do you listen to Joe Rogan at all by chance?
I have. Some of those episodes are a little too long for me. But yeah, when he, it's a lot of times, so I'll have a friend like send me hey man, you got to check out this episode.
Did you by chance listen? I got to go back and pull the guy's name up. I want to say it was either Nick something, but he's like specializes in aging, and he was talking about the effects of metformin on aging. Like he prescribes himself metformin. It basically, his contention is that it reduces the effects of aging.
Yeah, there's this whole thought out there that metformin can be used that's one of the off-target effects of metformin is, one is for weight loss, and the other, like the big idea is like you're talking about, the kind of an anti-aging thing. And I gotta look at it more carefully, but my quick kind of, this is me being skeptical again, the effect has got to be really just minuscule, like really minor. Because I mean, just like what we know about the biological mechanism of metformin, it suppresses hepatic glucose output a little bit. It's mildly will promote a little bit of weight loss. I think that's mainly because of this negative GI effects, reduces appetite.
Yeah,
there might be some other effect for that, but anyway, I mean, yeah, I would love to see that in comparison to like what lifestyle does for the same thing for aging. right? And if you look at the magnitude of the two effects, it's going to be just no question that lifestyle is more effective.
The other thing I wanted to ask you is like,
Yeah.
so you teach CrossFit in your classes, right?
I borrow some concepts, I would say, from what you all teach at the level 1. And then so like, for example, I do teach fitness, the definition of fitness. The way I've done it, and I have this whole list of learning objectives. The first learning objective on my syllabus for my exercise physiology course is what is fitness. And I even simplify it a little bit from the CrossFit's definition. I just say, just think of fitness as work capacity. I don't really get into the broad time and modal domains because I'm not going to be coaching people on specific movements and all that stuff. But work capacity, and I do get into definitely get into time domains because I teach a couple of different classes, but especially like in the graduate metabolism course that I teach, we just finished the first part of the course, which is like 6 or 8 weeks or so. That's all about the metabolic energy systems. And from a coaching, like transfer the science stuff to the coaching realm, metabolic energy systems is equal to time domains, right? Like just conceptually. So, and most of those students are going to go on to careers in strength and conditioning. That's like their goal. So we really spend a lot of time on that. And I borrow / have modified, adapted a lot of things from CrossFit.
So for those people who maybe not have taken the level 1, what he's referring to is that is the third model that we use in the What is Fitness lecture, which is the metabolic pathways. So there's phosphagen, glycolytic, and then aerobic or oxidative, however you want to reference it. But then where those models match up in the definition of fitness is, when the definition of fitness is work capacity across broad time, that's where that bioenergetics comes in. So that's where that happens. So that's really cool that you use that. And obviously we do a very dumbed down version of that because it's so time constrained, but
it's time constrained, but it's good. I'll ask you the same question that I just asked on an essay for my students.
Okay.
I'm really curious what you do here. If
Okay.
you had one metabolic pathway, if you had to pick one metabolic pathway to live with and only that one for the rest of your life, which one would you use?
And I'd really have to chew on that because of my limited understanding of my limited understanding of metabolic pathways is, I guess you'd really struggle to live your daily life without the oxidative pathway because I'm just kind of sitting in that all the time. But I guess I would have to choose the glycolytic pathway for the same reasons that we talk about in the course, is just because of it has the most carryover between the three. It allows me to go short, medium, and long. I don't know if that's a sufficient answer because it's probably one of those things where, you need all three. But if I was forced to choose and pick one, I would probably have to take that middle one with the broadest carryover between the three.
Yeah. Well, your answer is awesome. First of all, you passed the test.
Okay, perfect.
No, actually, what I tell the students, I don't tell them this at the time. I don't know. I can't remember when I present this part to it, but there's no wrong answer or right answer. It's just like, tell me what you think, and then talk. Basically, it's a prompt to get them to talk through what they know about metabolism. It also turns out to be such a hard question. I gave it as an essay in class once, and I said never again because it just like stressed them out too much. So now I think I give them 3 or 4 weeks as a take-home exam. It's one of 2 questions on a big take-home exam that they take.
Yeah.
And it's so fun to read the responses and the rationale. So it turns out, and every year actually I change my answer. This year my answer is actually exactly the same one that you just gave. Is that
okay?
The anaerobic glycolytic pathway has the greatest sort of breadth of, it covers, like if you think of it like as a bell curve, and most of my activities are going to fall under that time window. Like I need to walk for anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes. And I might have to, like I'm thinking about walking through the airport. It would be like an interval style walk through the airport, like start, go, and then stop and recover, go, stop and recover. The anaerobic system is the only one that produces the byproducts that feed back on it to tell metabolism to stop. So that's why it hurts. But then the other question, the counter to that is like, all right, well, without the phosphagen system, for example, how are you going to get out of bed? Right?
Yeah, I can't do anything that requires me to just really quickly do something either.
Like, how do you go to the bathroom? How do you get off the toilet? You're stuck.
Yeah,
So
I'm definitely not going to get myself out of any sort of dangerous scenario, you
nope,
know?
nope. One student wrote about that chasing bears. Anyway, it's probably longer than you want to talk about this particular thing, but
No, I
the
love
point
it.
is,
I love this stuff.
we're like we've lost some listeners, but the cool thing is like you can't reduce it. That's the point of the assignment, to actually derive at this conclusion. It's an impossible question, and you cannot reduce the human metabolic engine to into like subcompartments like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the screwed up thing about how we teach it, is that we teach it in compartments, like one pathway at a time, and we have students memorize every freaking step of the pathway, all the different enzymes and their reactants and products and all that stuff, and you got to like regurgitate on the exam, and that does nothing to teach about how useful the information is in a coaching setting or in a educational setting, where it comes back to like, okay, your power output for this particular time point, that's going to kind of be where you've got all three, like in say 6 minutes or something, you kind of got all three systems interacting together to produce maximal power output.
And
anyway,
so what you're talking about is, what you're talking about is kind of my, I don't want to say my beef, because I don't really have a beef, but kind of a counterpoint against when people kind of bash CrossFit when compared to something like the CSCS. You know, so the CSCS, I mean, I've taken that test. Like I don't know that anybody's qualified to do anything by passing that test. And that's not to bash the test, right? So like there's a ton of information on there. But I don't know that simply going in there, taking that test and leaving there would suggest that you are prepared to walk. At least not when compared to the level one. I think you're at least given some practical skills. And we would even say that when you leave the level one, that's not the end. Obviously, you're still not prepared. Like you're constantly going. But I guess it just probably bugs me a little bit that CSCS is kind of used as the standard, and they really kind of poo-poo on CrossFit. And I think it's because there's not enough people that know enough about each. And I'm like, well, I've taken both, and I'm like, I would take the level one if you're like, hey, in a week you have to work with athletes, and I'm like, okay, then I'll just take that one, you know. So
I've never taken the CSCS, but I get a lot of questions from students. Like actually, just this past week, I had a former student come up to me after one of my classes. We were kind of like passing each other, going in different directions, and she goes, "Oh, hey, I've been meaning to ask you, do you have any advice for me? I'm taking the CSCS." And I said, well, never taken it, but here, from what I know, just start training your memorization muscles, like
that's all it is, right? So like
really just double down on the facts and their lists of facts, and I guess they're in different sections by topic. And
I struggled because I like a lot of it is just I'm reading the questions, and I know from my experience and from training and from researching and stuff like that, I know how I want to answer, but I also know that that's not the answer they're looking for. Like I know that I'm like, you want something very specific here, which I disagree with vehemently. But again, this is a test, so I'll play the game type deal.
Yeah. I don't know if I could do that, man.
It's really kind of annoying. But that being said, I do think that, and this is something we do recommend and encourage at the end of every seminar, is that people should seek out those types of credentials, like whether you think they're useful or not. Kind of going back to where you started before, which is kind of like questioning your own thoughts, questioning your theories about things.
Always
like I don't think you should kind of, and again, to use the same term, I don't think you should be like poo-pooing on something that you really don't have any experience with. You know, don't say that this credential is garbage if you haven't sat and taken a test or done that, and I try not to do that. So I try not to speak to things that I don't have any experience with.
Yeah. Well, that's a good practice. It's a good,
Well, I'm a little older these days, and I've done that in the past where I've exceeded my knowledge base, and I'm like, okay.
For sure. I mean, I made that mistake I've made the same mistake with like using my PhD, for example. When I was a newly minted PhD, I thought that meant that I knew about what it meant to be fit. And I can tell you that it does not. It doesn't. Yeah, you can actually, in hindsight, I actually described those. There was this time period where it's actually really funny. I followed the guidelines. I just followed the 30 to 60 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity per day, kind of check the box, really, really boring stuff. Like I remember getting up at 4 a.m. to go ride the stationary bike for 45 minutes before I had a really busy day, like in the lab or something. It was about 6 years of that. And I got fat, got really super out of shape. And I thought I was fit. I thought I was like, I was doing what the guidelines say, I'm going to be fine. But I was like, I want to say I had a DEXA scan that put me at over 30% body fat at one point. And now
Oh, wow.
I walk around at like 12% or something, 10 to 12%.
I was going to say, you're pretty lean.
Well, it's, CrossFit.
Yeah,
it
there
works.
you go.
It's wild.
So if you were going to recommend some of that literature,
mm-hmm.
kind of getting into the academia, what do you think would be most beneficial for the average CrossFit coach?
Gosh, man, I don't know that there's a good single good resource. Man, I have to like, that's a great question, and I'm somewhat unprepared to give you.
And I guess you like, I asked because there's so many different realms there. So, I mean, you could go kind of just straight stick, physiology, which
mm-hmm.
is uber nerdy, which largely is kind of useless, like on the coaching floor. Like it's information we need to know, but I don't know that it helps me from a practical standpoint.
Right.
And then there's the more strength and conditioning stuff, which is a lot of, learning the technical complexities or the anatomy of movements, the anatomy of the body, the programming aspect. Like if you were to so to throw the question back on you, if you only had to pick one out of all of that, what do you think would be something that would really add the most to a coach's knowledge base and allow them to help train athletes?
It's a total cop out, because I can't think of anything that I wouldn't find the answer that I was looking for, like in the CrossFit journal, right? Like that's
super
really
interesting.
Those are the best. Like it's for that, the blending of the two kind of sides we're talking about, like something that's practical for coaches and useful for coaches, but also has a theoretical and scientific basis. Like those early CrossFit journal articles, man. That plus there's I don't have like any on my shelf in my office, but there are some really good books, good resources from some of the sort of sub communities of CrossFit. So for example, like there's some good books on like Olympic weightlifting, like some of the stuff you're talking about, like fundamentals of like anatomy, functional anatomy as it relates to sport performance and, Olympic lifting and gymnastics. My understanding is that I've heard better answers to your question for those specific realms. And again, I don't have like the list of them handy, but for like physiology, we don't have the equivalent to that's useful in any way, really, for anybody that I would recommend. Like we just don't have that in our field. Like it's just a glaring hole that we don't really have much that's useful.
Do you struggle knowing that as a teacher, for like you're putting people through their doctorate and their master's degree?
Well, we do. Yes, definitely. And that's, some of the research direction that I'm talking about, like moving forward, that there's multiple things that influence, like when a professor decides what the direction of their lab is going to go. One of them is look at the problems that currently exist. Like where's our knowledge end? Like, and also what are the flaws in our pre-existing approaches? And when we can identify those, then we can identify the, appropriate next steps for moving things forward. So part of the reason for like pursuing CrossFit informed, hypothesis driven research, where I already know what the answer is going to be, is because of what the answer to your question. Does it bother me? Sure. Absolutely. So I can sit around and complain about it, which I do. Or I can actually do something. Right. So that's what we're doing. Then there's other like segments though, for like the students that we have in our various specific aspects of our program. So for most of our undergraduate students, they're not going on to careers in coaching. Our undergraduate students who are getting degrees in exercise and sports science, probably 95% of them are going on to PT school. At least that's their goal. And our placement rate is pretty good. So they want to
We have a lot of athletes here because we're kind of like at the doorstep of Old Dominion University.
Yeah.
And Phil Sabatini, who's our weightlifting coach, he's a lecturer in the exercise science department and or exercise phys department.
Yeah.
But you're right. A lot of them, probably 8 out of 10 that come in here are PT students or trying to go to PT school.
Yep. Yeah, that's like so typical. Yeah. And then we have, like I mentioned, we have a strength and conditioning cohort, small. We have a very small strength and conditioning program that we're working. There's a lot of room for growth and improvement in that department, in that group. And I'm working really hard to, at least I teach the classes for that. And I'm working hard to shore up my instruction in that regard, to make sure that these people know, at least leave my class knowing the definition of fitness, knowing that, well, what I do is like, they come in with a degree in exercise science in my class and they can't actually define fitness, right? And it shows like, hey, how, but don't you guys have exercise science degrees? You can't define. And the other thing I ask them, and I don't have a good one for this, is define exercise. Right?
Yeah.
That's a term that and I've got a few like kind of candidate definitions that I'm, kind of brainstorming about. But, anyway, like it just to show like we have, it's not a concrete, like really established science. We've got a lot of room for growth. And and actually, who I look to for a lot of this stuff, I'm going to sound like a fanboy or whatever, but I don't care. This is like a scientist respecting another scientist, is Greg's stuff that he's talking about, like when he gives talks at the level ones, the MDL ones, and what he's putting out a lot on the .com and so forth about consensus science versus real science, or postmodern science versus modern science. That has significantly impacted my whole framework. Everything my whole approach to science is evolving in large part because of that influence.
Can you elaborate on that a little? We touched on it briefly when I talked to Shaka and her husband, Scott, about that.
Yeah.
But can you, and that was a little bit more like mainstream medicine is where they were talking about it. But can you talk about that a little bit from the kind of exercise science side of the house?
Yeah, well, what it is like a philosophy of science that cuts across all disciplines. So absolutely. He talks about it primarily in the broad health sciences and how it totally corrupts medicine. And that's why we have this mess of chronic disease. But the concept applies to really anything. So, and he's been critical of exercise science in this regard too. So, modern science versus postmodern science, we'll start there. So what we have now is postmodern science. And what postmodern science does is say, hey, let's all get together. We say sit around and we need to come up with fundamental ideas and maybe recommendations about our practice that are maybe practical for the rest of the world, or things that we all can agree to be true. And that word "agree" is the key word there. So it's like we sit around and talk about stuff that we can all agree on, and we call that science. And so we have consensus statements that emerge, and these are the things that become best practices, how we should do things in our field, and how, like, for example, these are how people should exercise. We have the mainstream physical activity guidelines, new edition just released in 2018. That's the 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity per week. And that's a consensus statement based on the totality of the evidence. Well, what that becomes, though, the problem with that is it becomes dogma, right? And dogma is the antithesis of science, right? So consensus science actually leads to the opposite functionality of what science is supposed to be in the first place, which is actually discovering new things, discovering new truths, and challenging ideas. And so, yeah, you asked me, like, you asked if I was in a rough spot, or do I have any pushback? Well, you know what? If I do, that's actually probably a good sign. If I'm in a rough position, that's a good sign that I'm doing something right, because it's like challenging dogma and challenging the consensus view, which is that 30 minutes a day of aerobic exercise is fine, right? Like that, basically that is, if I summarize what my field's view is, 30 minutes of low to moderate intensity, steady state cardio is really all you need to do, and you're going to be okay, right? That's the view of my field. And I'm saying, no, I don't think that's sufficient as at least as a message. Yes, it's going to help you to not die too early, but your life still might suck. Anyway, coming back to the whole thing of the different types of science. So real science or modern science is something more like physics or math. And this is where you really see this played out as an industry, where you have a problem to solve. Otherwise, for example, your business may not be successful. Greg was not handcuffed by the constraints of modern science when he was developing his fitness methodology that we now know as CrossFit. What he needed to do was to find something that worked. And what he did was pull from all these different disciplines, gymnastics, monostructural conditioning, and weightlifting, combined them in a bunch of different ways, and found that actually it doesn't really matter how many ways, the sky's the limit as far as my creativity, how many ways I combine these things, you're going to produce this powerful stimulus. But there's some key things. You got to go fast and hard, even high intensity. And the movement should be primarily the big movers, right? The functional movements. Well, that's what he doesn't, from his view, I think you don't necessarily need a research study to support that when it's been borne out in industry, right? Because industry support. So his takeaway is that industry really supports the real, quote unquote, real science, modern science, discovery of solutions to problems that have, they're meeting a practical demand. I've heard him say that this is the process that developed the TV in your house, the flat screen TV, these computers that we're talking on, using to communicate right now from Athens, Georgia to Virginia. Put man on the moon, right? That is modern science. That's real science, as opposed to consensus science, where we sit around and argue about stuff, and then we come out with something that we can all agree on, and it doesn't actually promote discovery. It actually, if you take it to its full end, it will actually suppress discovery.
And not only does it not only promote discovery, the thing that I struggle with, and I'm not a super sharp guy, but the thing that I struggle with is it's not producing results either. So if this is consensus and this is what everybody agrees upon, then I'm still struggling to understand why, if this is effective by that definition, why chronic disease rates continue to skyrocket.
Yeah,
and again, that's a whole other thing about okay, well, people have bad discipline and they're eating poorly. I can agree on that too. However, we're going to have the same discussion about dietary guidelines as well. So that's always what I struggle with, is what you're telling me is not matching the result that we're seeing in society.
Well, and I went through my evolution of my training years, from my academic training years, from my undergraduate degree in exercise science and then master's, PhD, and postdoc. We kept saying the same stuff over and over again. We kept doing studies that supported the same freaking consensus conclusions over and over and over again. And then the next iteration was to get a bigger study and a better statistically powered study and a more expensive study that said that gave the same conclusions, that this amount of primarily aerobic activity, maybe look at some weights once in a while, but don't do too much weight training. Right. That's basically I'm getting people a little bit, but we just it's just this on repeat, this message that's on repeat, and it's producing the opposite of result. Things are getting worse. And so there's my frustration with the field. Exactly what you just said is this. We're just running ourselves into the same brick wall over and over and over again. And no one's looking around saying, hey, we should maybe change something. Right.
Do you see any sort of light at the end of the tunnel there? I mean, I know you said earlier that you feel that things are starting to turn a little bit, but at what point do you think this ship begins to course correct?
It's a generational shift. Right now, a lot of our leadership is kind of the old guard. And that's not to get, I might offend, that's where I could get offensive to people, and I don't mean to be, but I think it's, you got a kind of a younger group of thought leaders kind of finding their strides in their careers. And I think there's a lot less opposition to new ideas, just like with anything else. Right. So I think that, and I think, as we've talked about over email, and we changed the messages, I'm seeing this play out in the even younger generation than like us, like my students, for example. In the 5 years I've been doing CrossFit, just at the societal level, there's been dramatic, in my mind, shift in the acceptance of CrossFit. And it's not as controversial as it even was in 2015. For example, one of the first things I did in the academic space with CrossFit at all was I created a first-year freshman seminar at the university on controversies and trends in fitness and health. That's the title of the seminar. And the idea was to sit around and we could like talk about CrossFit and how controversial it is with the students. Well, and that was basically kind of how it was for maybe the first year. But even then, there wasn't as much like vigorous debate as I maybe anticipated. And even now it's like everyone, all the students, we just had our last day of that class today. I would say that this group, no one's really like arguing about CrossFit. They're 18, right? They've never, actually, if you think about it, the whole time they've been alive, CrossFit has been a thing, right? The entire.
To think about that is funny, and some people bring it up because we have some kind of anecdotes in the lecture specifically for the CrossFit for the What is CrossFit lecture about the traditional gym setting, and there are people coming into CrossFit seminars now who don't know anything other than CrossFit.
They don't know like that exactly. I have that same kind of dissonance with them. Is that like I grew up in the Globo gym doing, bis and tris on, that was Tuesdays. Mondays was chest and back, right? Like that's what I think of as the gym. And for them, that's like one of 17 different flavors of exercise. The others are CrossFit and all the other boutique fitness things. So that's actually something we talk about in the course now, is like boutique fitness and like what the next trend is going to be, how they kind of come and go.
Yeah.
So that's neat, but that's an evolution in the conversation with my students that's happened over the last couple of years. So coming back to your original question, like, what do I see? Is it getting better? I think it's going to get, in the future, I'm optimistic that things will get better because thoughts and ideas and practices and the whole industry is evolving so fast. Science is always the slowest to catch on to anything, to everything. But I think that's starting to happen. I'm not the only professor of exercise science doing research around CrossFit by any stretch. In fact, I'm one of the later ones to the game. There's a guy named Yuri Fato just down the street at Kennesaw State University. He's probably I view him as the thought leader in the space. He's got probably 20 some publications on CrossFit. Yeah, he's a good dude. Smart guy.
Where are most of those published? Do you know?
There's several journals. A go-to journal for him seems to be one that's just called Sports. It's a relatively new journal, easy to find because it's got a cool name. And his biggest contribution, I would say, and I think it has gotten some attention, but I think needs more, is on the injuries thing. He's got a paper that shows with 4,000 respondents to a survey that he put out, injury rates in CrossFit, and it's really like, it's unimpressive. There's just not that much injury that happens. I can't quote specific numbers because it's not in front of me, but actually I made an Instagram post on that study when it came out, so I should remember it better. But and he also was able to track, like, there's a certain time window in the athlete's journey, like when they're most prone to injuries and stuff. Like early on, if you go, basically what I took away from it was, it's the guy who was probably like in his 40s or 50s who was fit and strong in the 1990s that comes in and does too much CrossFit too fast. He's the one that's most likely to get injured. That was like, that's a bro science interpretation of his data.
Yeah. And that's, and if you have done any sort of, you understand that basically you had somebody who had a little bit more mature training age, took that time off, which basically brings them back to zero as far as training. And they're just like, but I can still do it. And this is when we talk about this, because that is one of the factors we have to take into account when we're discussing intensity, because psychologically he still lives in that state where he is fit. Yeah. He's like, I can still do it, but physically, this is a terrible idea at this point. And that's just something we need to understand from a training standpoint, is we need to identify that person, that guy or that girl, and say, listen, I understand we'll get there, but I need you to pump the brakes. I need you to pump the brakes. Cool. Yeah. Well, listen, man, I could do this all day, but we might be putting some people to sleep. So
we've been talking for a while, man. I'm sorry.
Yeah. This is good. I love it. This is perfect. This is exactly what this is for. And I really hope people, the big takeaway from this is, the idea here is to marry both the academia and the practical portion of this, and then let things play out, because the reality is, like, CrossFit is unmatched in its ability to produce, fitness on a scale that we've never seen before, both in an individual and at mass. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be exploring other ideas.
Right.
So, and I think people like you are really bringing that to the forefront, because you do have a lot to offer the CrossFit community. And I really do think people should be seeking out people like you and people like Lon Kilgore and reading more of the journal, and just stuff like that in order, because I think the demise of the CrossFit community, in my opinion, would lie in the fact that we fail to continue to educate ourselves. And we just rely on that CrossFit is effective. And I don't think that is a good enough stance to combat the people who want to come in and bash CrossFit.
Yeah, the concern I would have with that, and I do have my level 1, but I only have like maybe, I think it was like 6 months of volunteer coaching experience. So I can't speak to like expertise or virtuosity in coaching with any authority. But I would say what you just said is a recipe for stagnation and staleness. And I mean, that'd be fun if I were to ever have my own podcast and ask you a bunch of questions. I would ask, like,
we can set it up.
Like, what do you like? Do you see a lot of that, and why do you think that is? Like, kind of seems like a lot of coaches can maybe just fall into the same pattern of doing the same old, and not really innovating. And I think there's also some burnout in coaching sometimes.
I think it's a lot of that, and I think largely what has made the affiliate community very strong is simultaneously its greatest weakness, which is like the freedom to do whatever you want, which largely leads people to rest on their laurels and sets them up for a massive amount of potential failure down the road, but makes them very vulnerable to things going on, which is like they're not paying attention to how to execute the program better. And Greg talked about this at the summit when somebody was talking. They used the term functional fitness, and basically his response was, "Hey, it's not CrossFit just because you decided to do it smarter." And that would be my pitch to everybody, is just like, listen, the level 1, the level 2, the level 3, which you're doing some work for, the level 4, like that's not the end. This is not over. It's forever. Like you said earlier, you're like, hey, I'm done when I retire when I'm 60. And I'm like, that's where I think coaches should live. Yeah.
I probably won't retire. I don't see that in my cards.
Yeah. I probably won't either.
Right. You just kind of like, it's constantly evolving, right? Like constantly trying to get better. So.
And I'm constantly figuring out different ways to explain it or understand it better. And when people ask about the level 1 or the level 2 or taking the level 3, I just tell them it's very basic. Reread and read the level 1 trainer guide until you feel like you thoroughly understand those concepts, and then read it again.
And then start over. Yeah. And then start over.
I mean, I've taught, I don't know how many seminars I've taught, but every time I sit and I watch somebody else give a lecture, I understand it a little bit better. And I've given those lectures hundreds of times.
Well, I think actually that's one of the cool things when I hear you and the other Jason talk on this show. That's one of the cool things that I get from pretty much every episode is you guys actually bring a lot to the table and bring a lot to the community through the conversations you're having with each other and with your guests, because there's a lot of wealth of knowledge and good stuff in all your experience with coaching. And I'm a fan, dude. You guys are pumping out episodes every day, and I'm like refreshing my Spotify, like, hey, is there a new episode today? Because I just love listening to what you guys have to talk about. I got a 15-minute commute to work every day, so like the drive time it won't be for this episode. This one's too long. The drive time is between that and my trip to the gym. I can usually get an episode a day, so
that's cool.
I appreciate that, and like I was saying, all the stuff that you guys, like those kinds of insights about like virtuosity and excellence in coaching. As a fan, I appreciate that because it does kind of carry over to other parts of life and my work and everything. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, I've failed to find many things that I can't take the concepts from CrossFit and just lay them into business or life or anything else. Like it's pretty cool stuff. So
focus on the fundamentals and pursue excellence, and that's kind of the bottom line.
Well, listen, brother, this has been awesome. I actually have to go coach class right now.
Oh, shoot. Okay. Yeah,
No, you're good. Again, I've been doing this long enough. I can just run out there and do it real quick. But where can people find you on social media?
I'm on Instagram at Gains by Dr. J. It's Gains with a Z. By
of course.
Dr. J.
What else would it be with?
Right. And then that's probably the best way. And I also have an email, gainsbydrj@gmail.
Cool.
That's what I use for like my non-university stuff. So
yeah. So if you guys want to reach out to him and nerd out about exercise phys or any of that other stuff, please hit him up. And if you got questions about any of the concepts we talked about in this, because some of this stuff was pretty deep, but again, man, thanks. This was super cool. And I just appreciate what guys like you in the academic world and academia in general are doing to kind of push this message forward. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, man. This is a lot of fun.
Awesome, brother. Appreciate it.
All right. Take care.
Thanks for listening to Best Hour of Their Day. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First of all, it's free. How cool is that? There's a creation tool that allows you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer, so it becomes super simple. Some of these episodes with Fern or Todd or myself chatting with one another, we've done right within the app itself. Anchor will make it easy to distribute your podcast to all platforms, Spotify, Apple, and many more. And you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make an awesome podcast in one place. All you have to do is download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started today.
Come on, who doesn't have Spotify at this point? And if you were unaware, Spotify now is offering podcasts. That's right. On Spotify, you can listen to all your favorite artists, but also podcasts in one place for free. Spotify has a huge catalog of podcasts on every topic, including the one you're listening to right now, Best Hour of Their Day. On Spotify, you can follow your favorite podcasts so you never miss an episode. Premium users can even download episodes to listen to offline wherever you are, something I always do before I hop on a plane. And you can even easily share what you're listening to with your friends on Instagram and other social media platforms. Here's the deal. If you haven't done so already, be sure to download the Spotify app, search for Best Hour of Their Day on Spotify, or browse some other podcasts if you want. You can find them in your library tab. And also make sure to follow me so you never miss an episode of Best Hour of Their Day.
Thanks again for listening to Best Hour of Their Day. We hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, one more time, please leave us a review on Apple Podcast and send us any feedback you have to @besthouroftheirday on Instagram and besthouroftheirday@gmail.com if you want to shoot us an email. We appreciate you. Thanks again. Have a great rest of your day.